Welcome to the Canadian Beacon podcast. This is a special podcast. Okay, we're going to be talking about the abuses that are occurring as a result of this COVID mandate and how it is affecting Canada. And right now, I know with the Canadian military, it's always been a love-hate relationship with myself. I've always enjoyed it. I got my 12 years in the Canadian Military Reserves. I enjoyed the time there, but in many cases, I hated the time there because I saw the stupidity. This is where, bear with me, I'm going to explain what is going on currently. The Canadian military is in crisis. A crisis of leadership, of funding, of sexual misconduct, accusations, and a crisis of morale. When one thinks of the military, one would normally think teamwork, sacrifice, and having each other's back. However, the situation of the past year and a half has added another element of crisis, a crisis of division, discrimination, and unfair treatment within the ranks. While unfair COVID policies and events have affected all military regiments, there are some events and situations being forced specifically upon certain members of a specific regiment recently. This regiment is a regular force infantry battalion of the Canadian Forces. And like all areas of the CAF, are subject to the recent vaccine mandates and regulations being unfairly forced upon federal employees. All unvaccinated members of the CAF are being threatened with job loss and are experiencing different levels of discrimination within the ranks. But this particular regiment really takes the cake. It has come to light that those members who have chosen not to receive the experimental vaccine have been removed from internal online platoon chats and are now in a separate chat room so that the vaccinated regular force members will not be aware of the unfair treatment. These isolated, unvaccinated members are no longer allowed inside any of the buildings, and it's winter in Petawawa, even when adhering to physical distancing requirements, but are still expected to report for duty until they are dismissed from the military for not complying. They have been set up in separate mod tents outside with a single mod section and are required to be tested for COVID daily. They have been given an outhouse building to use, which is up next to the mod tent to use, and were initially given a generator and heater, remembering it is winter in Petawawa. The generator was quickly removed with no reason given, and then stated that it was needed for a training exercise in February, 2 months away. So that left the soldiers with no heat and unable to enter any buildings. They are also detailed to do snow shoveling, which is unusual in their occupation. They were told that if they wanted heat, they would have to get vaccinated. When word got around that they're being forced to stay in an unheated tent all day, a generator finally magically reappeared. While the vaccinated members were treated to a pig roast, the unvaccinated members were given physical make work jobs, again, snow shoveling, etc., ending with shoveling snow around the venue where the pig roast was occurring. We can only assume that the work task will continue until something changes. Either the members will be dismissed or these ridiculous mandates will end in some way. It would seem, however, that even if the mandates were to end, much harm has already been done and a deep division has been created within the armed forces. If Canada was in a combat situation, it would be very difficult to imagine that the leadership of this regiment would have the backs of those forced out into the cold tent. Our past and present armed forces members have made the commitment. They have committed to fighting for the freedoms that we as Canadians have enjoyed in the past, but no longer guaranteed. the freedom of choice, freedom of movement, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. These unvaccinated members of the armed forces are willing to risk their career, reputation, and source of income for what they believe is right. Historically, Canadian troops have fought for these rights, not only for Canadians, but for nations around the world. Whether one agrees or disagrees with mandates, is vaccinated or chooses not to be vaccinated, or even chooses not to share private health information, we cannot accept discrimination, disrespect, intolerance, or unfair treatment of anyone for their personal choices or beliefs. One could only wonder about the motivation of the leadership of this particular unit. Are they afraid of COVID? They are vaccinated. The others are tested daily and distanced. Are they frustrated with the non-compliance of a few members? It is true that soldiers are trained to follow orders, but no one should be expected to follow an order that they believe is wrong or dangerous. Are the leaders of this regiment trying to force compliance? This would seem to be the case when one considers the withholding of heat in December in Petawawa. However, the cost of their actions is high. They are causing irreparable division within the unit, damage to morale, more negative publicity for an already hurting military, anger and frustration, of course. Unfortunately, the situation in the military is simply a reflection of what's happening in Canada, a country that was once proud of being founded upon the principles of freedom, tolerance, and acceptance. Military members are guided by the Queen's regulations and orders, ethics and values to obey lawful orders and commands. The legality of these vaccine mandates is strongly being questioned in the courts. These non-complying members are simply doing what they were trained to do. Furthermore, written in the National Defense Act, which dictates the conduct of all military members, it states, every person who behaves in a cruel or disgraceful manner is guilty of an offense punishable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years. Would forcing people out into the cold all day long in Northern Ontario be cruel or disgraceful manner? Also, Section 95 of the National Defense Act reads, every person who strikes or otherwise ill treats any person who by reason of rank or appointment is subordinate to him is guilty of an offense and upon conviction is liable to imprisonment of less than 2 years. Further, the National Defense Act also has the famous Section 129(1), which reads, any act, conduct, disorder, or neglect to the prejudice of good order and discipline is an offense, and every person convicted is liable to dismissal with disgrace. The actions of the senior officers who place these men in an unheated tent in December and force them to do menial work because they're unvaccinated have committed all of these offenses. It is the legal responsibility of the senior military leadership to treat all members with fairness, goodwill, and respect. The conduct of the leadership in this particular regiment appears to be in direct contradiction to their own moral and legal code. Thank you to these service members that have been discriminated against for continuing the fight to uphold what Diefenbaker so eloquently expressed. I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. Thank you from the Canadian Beacon.